Well, this weekend the Chauvin trial is being recognized as a particularly good one for the defense. A lot of people in the sort of alt media space, certainly nobody really on television, have noted that despite the fact that we're still in the prosecution's turn to make their case, the prosecution's case has not rested yet. The defense has been able to use cross-examination as a platform to make quite a few good arguments, which poke holes in the prosecution's assertion that Derek Chauvin is absolutely responsible for the death of George Floyd, and that his actions, were the leading contribution to his death. And so I think a lot of people who are following this might be looking at it as, well, if the defense is doing this good when the prosecution's still making their case, think about how good things will look for the defense once the defense starts making their own arguments and presenting their own witnesses. And that is a good point if you're just strictly talking about the arguments being made here and the logical debate between the prosecution and the defense. But as anyone who is, I guess, not too idealistic about the judicial system, the logic of the two sides' arguments are not necessarily the deciding factor in whether or not a defendant is convicted or acquitted. Ultimately, it is the jurors who get to decide this. There is no sort of Ubermensch arbiter of logic and truth. Jurors are just ordinary people, and ordinary people fall victim to motivated reasoning. That being that if they had their minds made up prior to the beginning of the trial, and they were not open-minded, and they had already in their mind whether George Floyd was guilty or innocent, the arguments made by each side is not necessarily going to impact them, because if they already have the conclusion worked out in their head, they are going to take the arguments of the defense per se, if they believe that Derek Chauvin is guilty, and they will spin that in their head in such a way and rationalize how that argument is wrong, or why it doesn't matter, and why Derek Chauvin is still guilty. So, for example, the doctor who the prosecution brought in, that said, hey, I watched the video and it's clear that Derek Chauvin kneeling on his neck is what killed George Floyd, because you can just see it. And then the defense, and so if you're somebody who already thinks Chauvin is guilty, that's going to confirm your bias, and you're going to go, wow, that woman, she makes a great point. Because it's something you already agree with, so it's very easy for her to convince you of that statement. Her testimony in that sense seems genuine to you because you agree with it. Not necessarily because you trust her personally, but because you agree with the words. And so therefore, in that case, she seems to be a decent, honest person. But then the defense came and cross-examined her and said, hey, if you didn't see that video and you just saw George Floyd, in the morgue, and you were there examining him, what would you think would be the cause of death? And I believe she said overdose. And when that happened, people on Twitter just lit up and said, wow, what a great day for the defense. They got this woman who was a prosecution witness to say that they think that if you didn't watch the video, George Floyd died of an overdose. But that's not going to change the mind of somebody who's already decided that Derek Chauvin is guilty. The way that they will interpret that statement from her is that, with the video, with the added evidence of the video, it's clear to her that the cause of death was Derek Chauvin's knee on George Floyd's neck. They're going to discount anything that brings their predetermined conclusion into question, because that makes them question themselves, and that's something that is uncomfortable for people to experience. People enjoy feeling self-assured. They do not like feeling insecure. And so I'm not saying that this applies to the entire jury, because not necessarily, the idea, hopefully, through selecting a jury, you want to pick people who don't have their minds made up already. You want to pick people who are persuadable in one direction or another, people who are truly, don't have a dog in the fight. But at the end of the day, that's never really possible. People generally, there's going to be at least a couple people on a jury, if not more, who have their minds made up from the very beginning. If not because they're familiar with the case, but because of the sort of the demographics of the case. And I don't mean in a racial sense. I mean the way, sort of the way the story is, or I shouldn't say that. It's bigger than even demographics. It's more about how the story sounds in their head. When people don't have all the facts about a situation, they tend to, even if they try not to, they're going to fill in the blanks in their head. And depending on how they think, they're going to fill in those blanks differently. The example that Robert Barnes uses, who, as an attorney, has experience trying to pick jurors. One of the examples he uses to talk about this issue with picking jurors is that if you have an older man with a daughter, and you know this about the guy, and you're dealing with a rape case, that guy is going to be biased against the defendant and biased in favor of the alleged victim. And that's because that father has an instinct to protect his own daughters, and so when he sees another girl who is a potential victim, he looks at it from sort of a personal perspective, and he thinks, gee, if anybody ever tried to do that to my daughter, I'd kill him. And so, it makes them angry. Different people, based on their life experiences and based on their personal backgrounds, are going to fill in the blanks in a story at a trial differently. And typically, that is going to make them biased either in favor of the defense or the prosecution. And people need to remember that the prosecution in this case was sure to pick a jury that they thought based purely on demographics. We don't know, maybe they have other metrics too that they're using, would seem to be biased against Derek Chauvin relative to the overall Minneapolis population. Now, Minneapolis on the whole is overwhelmingly Democratic, and if you vote, and voted for Joe Biden, and if you voted for Joe Biden, that's a pretty good proxy that you think that Derek Chauvin is guilty. So even with a pretty representative sample of people from Minneapolis, of a jury truly of Derek Chauvin's peers, he would seem to be at a serious disadvantage going into the case. Now, to compound that disadvantage, the prosecution was sure to select an disproportionately non-white and young jury. Young people, of course, again, you would think they tend to skew Democratic. Let's just be honest about that. And non-white people tend to skew Democratic. And of course, there is the racial element to this case. This was the spark that ignited, the most recent race riots in American history. And so obviously the jury, by picking in disproportionately non-white jury, is trying to stack the deck against Chauvin. So he has a very serious disadvantage to overcome here. And so even if the defense does a great job, and you think, oh my gosh, they made such solid arguments, first of all, you might be yourself suffering from motivated reasoning and being more open to the defense's arguments and things to begin with, because, you might not believe the mainline Black Lives Matter narrative. But on top of that, of course, you have people who are inherently biased against the defense, who can excuse or rationalize away a lot of the seemingly good arguments that are made against the prosecution. So while there's been a lot of talk about the need for people who are expecting Chauvin to be convicted to temper their expectations because the defense does make a decent case, I think that likewise, people who might be at this point expecting Chauvin to be acquitted, best temper their expectations as well.